Hey everybody, welcome to a wonderful Thursday morning. Hope everybody's doing well. Going to try to do this in 5 minutes and hopefully it's helpful. But basically, Jennings' Good News to the Poor is a pretty straightforward book, and I think if you're at all Wesleyan, this coincides with what we've thought about for a long time. But essentially, this is an awesome book as far as the introductory summary that it has. Based on the introduction, it just tells you what the book is about and explains the argument. And then at the end of each chapter, there's some conclusions that tell you what the chapter was about. So that's really awesome. He pulls most of his information from the three sermons that you see listed there, 98, 88, and 51. Like I said, the introduction gives some details. So these next bits come from that introduction. Did a thorough reading, skim reading of the text, and there's more nuances to it, but basically this is the big idea. So the demystification of wealth, basically this idea that we fight today in capitalism, that more stuff means you're happier and gives you more stuff. And so Wesley fights for this break between the economic forces that assume we have power and privilege and those who we are hurting in chapter 2. This calls for a preferential treatment or preferential option for the poor, and that we don't merely have concern for the poor, but we will legitimately immerse ourselves in the concrete reality of the poor. This might call, we would say, solidarity with the poor and actually participating with them in their poorness. His definition of wealth is actually anyone who, and I'll put this in the quotes in the Cohera, but anyone who can take care of all of their necessities and have a little extra is one who is considered wealthy. And so most people would be considered wealthy in this regard. So it's not talking a certain level, again, but cover your basic needs and a few conveniences, and then you are a wealthy person and you can give to the poor. But the immersion in the concrete reality of poor and the solidarity with the poor then becomes the main criterion for all Christian action. He talks about this evangelical economics, which we'll talk about here in a few slides. Because you're in solidarity with them. Chapter 4, he talks about protest against the injustice. We want to transform the things, activities, and practices that are destructive to the lives of the poor. And we're going to fight those injustices in the forms of exploitation. Again, he talks about colonialism and slavery and those sort of things as examples of that. And then in chapter 5, he kind of goes on this idea that everything is God's and everything belongs to God. And so we simply need to understand ourselves as stewards, and that he actually says private property is theft, which I think you've heard before. But we can't own anything because it's all God's. And so we're given stewardship over that. But the criterion for which we want to handle the wealth that we have is a concern for the poor and make that the criterion by which we operate in economics. So he goes as far to affirm the Acts 2-4 model, having everything common, giving to all in need. And then, of course, that idea comes into controversy because that's not possible. The author, Jennings, did say he was thinking an Anglican, model of church with Church of England, same thing, but the government of England, in that he didn't trust his government to take care of things. And so there's this idea of what he wants to do with the reality of actually getting in the reality of the world and how the government operates. And so it created some tension. He tried to push this on the Methodists. They rejected it as not plausible. Chapter 7, basically, grace actually works. And this was a good quote I like. This means that a transformed economics is testimony to efficacy of grace, and an untransformed economics is counter evidence to the gospel. That is, if you say you're a Christian, you must indeed deal with economics and how you handle your money in a way. Chapter 8, why did Wesley fail? Basically, he compromised the way he lived when he had opposition, and the author says persecution in that, and so then everybody is like, well, you can't do it, we can't do it, and so on and so forth. And then chapter 9, basically the relevance of Wesley is that only a gospel that produces holiness, scriptural holiness, can transform the economy of death. And he goes on to talk about the economy of death. Jennings does in the way that we would see we're exploiting each other, exploiting the poor, exploiting the earth, all that sort of stuff, and then abolish it and in place give it something that can really be good news to the poor. And so the big kind of main thing I think from this book that we need to pull from is evangelical economics, and there's some quotes there. But what does it mean that we have the gospel inform the way that we interact with the sphere of economics? How we make a living is crucial. And so he talks about interrelationship between criticism of wealth, the forms of solidarity with the poor, the notions of stewardship, and the vision of an economic practice based on the Pentecostal community. And then in 117, for Wesley, the only legitimate claim to the earth's resources is based not on the industry or capital or enterprise or labor, but on the needs of our neighbor. This is the heart of evangelical economics. So essentially, here's just a couple more quotes that I'll put in there. But this idea that we can't be Christians, we can't say that we have the gospel unless we have concern for the poor and care for the poor, and our interest being immersed in the solidarity of the poor is the criterion by which we should then judge how we deal with economics. And the only way that is going to be effective is by scriptural holiness, in which grace transforms us so that we see the world in a different way and that we reject worldliness. And so I'll put these quotes in Cohera, but I think it's a pretty straightforward book. Again, reading the introduction gives you a great insight into the argument. And again, I think this is pretty standard Wesleyan thought for stuff. So anyhow, that was 6 minutes. Hopefully not too long. See ya.